Hello everyone, welcome to this, our Friday lunchtime Sensemaker at the end of what was already quite an extraordinary week. We've had a run of think-ins at Tortoise this week that have been, by any measure, quite high fibre. We started the week with thinking about how would you conduct, if in effect, a skills revolution to make the most of the changes in the workforce required by climate. Gordon Brown joined us on Tuesday, where we kind of fronted up the whole scale of the failure on global vaccination program, not to mention how do you denuclearize the world. On Wednesday, the culture of political failure with Neil Ferguson, how much that sits with political leadership, how much that sits in the bureaucracy. Yesterday, essentially a whole afternoon looking at what is an education emergency in the UK. So what would have anyway been quite a busy week, then crescendos with what feels to me like one of those really, really hard questions. And you need to be on your game intellectually because you have to have read the slides that my colleague James Wilson, who's here on the chat, put together. You have to be able to not only read those as speed, because it seems as though the carousel is racing towards the weekend, James. It was quite hard to read this. I'm going to come to you in a second to get a sense of those. But this is one of those conversations where Tortoise is really trying to do what we set ourselves up to do. We thought, could you create a newsroom that's open, where you had what I used to have at the BBC or the Times, but in public and with people who are not just journalists, people who've got a depth of expertise. And by that, what I mean is, can you argue out a really complicated issue that you would expect to argue out in, let's say, a Times leader conference? Because the question of Chinese influence, particularly on the campuses of UK universities, is one of those issues that you can really argue both ways. You can either say Chinese money is imperiling independence, intellectual independence, most importantly, but also putting at risk national security, in which case there's no argument for it. Or you can say, actually, if you cut off Chinese involvement, Chinese money, and as a result, Chinese students, more likely you ostracize China and you take the risk of turning a competition into a real conflict. You reduce human contacts, let alone the benefits of collaborative research. And you can make the argument in both ways. And what I hope is, in the course of this conversation, we will hear from lots of people with different experiences. The most important thing in a think-in is bring your own experience, bring your own expertise, your own point of view. So please do weigh in. I already see people coming in the chat, and if you've been to a think-in with me before, you'll know that I'm going to try and bring as many in as possible. Before I come to Jeanette and Henk, and thank you both for joining us, what I was going to ask is just, James, will you just talk us through your slides? Because I suppose they do show overall a picture of the university sector in the UK having a deeper relationship with China, even as the relationship has become more politicized.
Absolutely. So this first slide really emphasizes the growth of the Chinese student cohort in the UK and the relative speed at which this has taken place. You can see that within the last 10 years, it's overtaken the number of students who come in from the EU pretty kind of drastically. And the sector is hugely reliant on them now. So 33% of all new university entrants last year in the UK were Chinese. And 13 British universities now, at least 10% of the students are Chinese, including Imperial, Manchester, and LSE. Some people estimate the Higher Education Statistics Agency estimates the higher education Chinese fees in the higher education sector to account for 1.7 billion, and that's estimated to be at 5% of all revenue in this sector. So it's a kind of very hefty cohort and it's bringing a lot of money. This one is essentially shows, again, the speed at which collaboration with China in British academia has really raced up. So you can see that, again, within the last 10 years, the collaboration between China and the UK has gone from 9th to 2nd place, overtaking several EU nations. And this is measured by co-authorship between British and Chinese researchers on peer-reviewed journals. It now comprises 11% of the total UK output of peer-reviewed journals. There was a controversial couple of donations, well, several controversial donations, but I chose to focus on this one in particular from Huawei to Jesus College, Cambridge. A Times Freedom of Information request revealed that in 2019, Jesus College accepted £200,000 from the Chinese state and £155,000 from Huawei. And the latter covered 2-year research cooperation, and that included a very controversial white paper that talked about communications and technology infrastructure, and it mentioned Huawei very favorably, which led to accusations like one from Bob Seeley, the Tory MP, and the former British diplomat in China, Robert Henderson, that Huawei had essentially been able to buy itself a publication endorsed by the university. It doesn't just stop with higher education. Further down the ladder with schools, a Mail on Sunday investigation revealed that 17 schools in the UK are now owned by Chinese companies, and 9 of those companies are either owned or run by people who are very, very senior in the Chinese Communist Party. A lot of these schools were a private school, but these are all private schools, and several of them were either going to close or had closed and have been saved by a buyout from the company. And there are differing opinions on this. So some people say that, you know, for these schools to survive, they need this foreign investment. But some have sounded the alarm and said that this is essentially the Chinese Communist Party taking advantage of this weak link in the British education sector. Something which has really raised alarm bells is the level of collaboration between universities and Chinese institutions with links to the Chinese military, or to weapons manufacturers that export those weapons to other countries, or to areas like Hong Kong or Xinjiang, where there's Chinese repression taking place. Particular universities, Manchester, Birmingham, Strathclyde, and the research itself has often been about, so for example, Birmingham cooperated with Baidu, that's a Chinese search engine, which is actually under US sanctions for military connections, and it collects users' internet data to predict online behavior. Manchester University provided the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation with a taxpayer-subsidized research center, although Manchester has said this is now closed, but the research areas included drones, hypersonic missiles, and improved maneuverability. And this was researched in collaboration with a Chinese university with military links. And this is all according to a study by a think tank called Civitas.
James, thank you. I really appreciate that, and I'm going to bring in Henk Koopmans and Jeanette Ilieva. I want to come. The reason I wanted to frame it all there at the start was that I think that having some context for this is really important, and I also think I should sort of personally say 2 things. One is that I was a China correspondent in the 90s. I worked for the FT, and I was in Shanghai from 96 to just to the end of the century, to turn of 2000. And suppose my thinking on this is clearly colored. We at Tortoise have, you know, commissioned investigations into, you know, what seems to me to be the worst case of systemic human rights abuses in the world, in Xinjiang, in some of the real issues around the suffocation of liberty in Hong Kong, and the real national security or global security risks raised around Taiwan. I am nonetheless someone who spent, you know, 3 and a bit, nearly 4 years of my life in China, and have a real affection for it. And so I can't start this conversation without being honest about the emotional concern I've got about a world in which China and the West and the East grows further apart. So I come to that with my own prejudices. And the second thing is to say that we at Tortoise have, as you'll see at these events, often corporate partners. Now, our Sensemakers are always partnered by Santander. They partner our Sensemaker. We've done events with Huawei. So Henk is here, is the executive director of R&D for Huawei. We actually count ourselves quite lucky that actually in this debate, we often don't hear from the Chinese companies involved. And so we're really appreciating Henk coming. But I also want to be honest and say, look, we've worked with Huawei, and we know that some people think you shouldn't do that, and other people passionately think you should do that. But I wanted to make sure that everyone in the room knows that background from our point of view. What we hope we're going to be able to do is actually set out some of the detail of what's happening in terms of the nature of cooperation and some of the arguments around it. And so I'm going to come to Jeanette Ilieva, who's the founder and director of Education Insight. Jeanette, you have the sort of difficult job of having to try to patch together so many different things, issues around tech, issues around the competitiveness of the education sector. But this touches on both, doesn't it? It touches on what's the quality of the R&D that's happening in the UK, who are the students that are coming, and what's the independence and freedom, intellectual independence and freedom of university campuses. So can you just sort of start us off? What do you think on this issue?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for having me on your program. I have studied international student mobility flows for a couple of decades now. And I think it's very useful to set the context in which we talk about Chinese students studying overseas and the reliance of higher education systems on for example, on Chinese money. In that context, I would like to flag the fact that Chinese higher education is by far the largest higher education system in the world. It has massively expanded over the past 20 years from something like 6% participation rate in higher education in 1998 to 54% participation rate in 2018. And this equates to 47 million students. If I'm to compare it with the UK higher education system, they're obviously completely different in terms of scale. UK has about 2.5 million students. However, if we look at the proportion of Chinese students seeking to study overseas, about 2% of the domestic enrollments seek international studies, and they're all high achievers. If we again look at the OECD International Student Assessment, like PISA, China features very highly on international student assessments. Many of the Chinese entrants, or most of the Chinese students in the UK universities, actually have one of the highest graduate outcomes. If we look at the dropout rates among Chinese students, it's one of the lowest in the UK HE system. The dropout, sorry, that's non-continuation rate of Chinese undergraduate students is around 2%, and this compares to 7% of UK students. They are top achievers. But in addition to that, I think it's also fair to say that they've got a very high academic satisfaction with their experience. The National Student Survey in the UK shows that Chinese students are among the most satisfied student population in the UK. I think their satisfaction rate is at about 88%. Compared to significantly lower rates for other students, like for the UK, I think that's roughly 82%. So if we are to have an honest conversation about China, I think it's good to be mindful of the scale. China is a fifth of the world's population. It's about 18% of the globally mobile students across all countries across the world are coming from China. However, most of those students are distributed across the English-speaking destinations. The average for the OECD is, for example, 23% of the students that study in OECD countries are actually coming from China. For the UK, this proportion is 24%. So the UK is 1% above the OECD average in terms of concentration of Chinese students in UK universities. Mm-hmm. How does that compare to other countries? This is significantly higher in the USA, 34%, in Australia and Canada. Chinese students estimate 32%, significantly higher proportions as such. So I think it's really useful to be mindful of the scale of the number of Chinese students when we talk about them, but also the sheer fact that the UK education system is highly selective. And if we are to limit access to education to the best achievers, a high proportion of them would be coming from China.
Jeanette, thank you. I want to come to the research elements of this in a moment, but I want to hear from Henk, because Henk, I imagine that this is not exactly a kind of free lunchtime for you. I imagine that sort of every meeting you have, every dinner, every night out in the pub these days with people is this argument about whether or not Huawei itself can be trusted when it funds R&D. Can you do us a favor before you get into the sort of political arguments? Just tell us what Huawei actually does in the UK.
Thanks very much, James. Yeah, so first of all, I run Huawei R&D UK, so I don't want to be a spoilsport, but that's a British company. So I'm subject to British laws and British government. So that's quite important. But I know the topic of the debate, so I will go into it. But what we do, well, if I may spend 2 minutes, I mean, effectively, I hope this is an opportunity to get to know the company a bit more for everyone, and provides people with some useful info for when they talk about the matters they care about. They can actually use this information, I hope. And I'd actually like to start, if I may, with the why. As far as we're concerned, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, business is not about winning or actually losing, for that matter. It's not like football. It's not a finite game. There's no whistle at the end. It just goes on and on and on. And so whilst we want to outlast our competition by selling great products and that will have great technology in it, we're not interested in beating the competition. I don't even know what that means. We're not even interested in being number one. Don't know what the criteria is. And we're not interested in owning all the technology. It's pointless, and it doesn't really create any solutions from the problems that we face today. But what we do believe in is that digital technology, ICT, if you like, has the power to solve a lot of the problems that we all face today. And these problems nowadays are global. They're enormous. Global warming, pandemic, etc. No company, no country can solve this by themselves. We need to do this through collaboration. That's the reason why we work with universities all over the world to gain insight. And I hope I have the opportunity to give some examples later on and during this session. But that's the reason why we work with universities. And I think that's really important to get that point across. And when you then ask why in the UK, well, I think you don't have to be a brain surgeon. Look at all the stats. The UK universities, thank goodness, are fantastic. They are still in the top 10. And I think that's also a reason why, going back to Jeanette's point, where whilst we want to do collaboration with them, and why students come here, not just from China, but from all over the world. And she's absolutely right. It is, of course, also a question of scale. And that can sometimes be a bit daunting, even from my own Chinese colleagues here, who for the first time come to Cambridge to work here and then walk into Cambridge to look at a lovely medieval town and come back and say, gosh, there's a lot of Chinese tourists here. It is a matter of scale, I'm afraid. And yeah, that can be a bit daunting from time to time. Happy to go into in a minute into the details, but is that okay if I leave it there?
Would you, Henk, would you do that? Because actually there's a lot of debate about what kinds of research Huawei and what the scale is. So yeah, will you talk us through that?
Okay, I'll give you 2 minutes on that, and then we can expand on examples if you like. So I think it's best to just give some examples to actually show you what it is. But as I said, the research that the universities do and the reason why we collaborate them is about insight. Maybe I give you one thing that everybody knows probably about, is that if you ever heard of computers and processors, you may have heard of Moore's law. Basically, some kind of idea prediction that every 2 years the number of transistors on a chip would double. And unfortunately, that prediction is no longer true. And it is getting harder and harder. So, of course, we work with universities to get shorter term ideas as to maybe can you bring processor and memory together? Are the solutions there? And longer term ideas. So a university says, well, guess what? We looked at ants and they're tiny little brains, but guess what? They managed to forage food and create entire societies. And we're studying into that direction. And yeah, we fund them to do stuff in that direction, which I have no idea what it's going to lead to. It may come up with something, it may come up with nothing, it may come up with something in the short term or long term. So sometimes it's very specific, and it's to do with products that we are working on. So for example, doing search on the phone, and we may say, right, okay, these days it's a thing called graph search. I won't go into the technical detail. How can we do that better? Because the likes of Google and others are masters at this, and we want to make sure that our search engine for, I don't know, a map or search criteria works well. And other times, as I said, it's much more open-ended research, and we have no clue where it's going. And of course, it aligns often with the specialism, the USP, if you like, of the university. Most universities develop some kind of USP. That's why you go there. And other times, it's something that we specifically want to examine, and we believe universities can give us some insight and can help.
And Henk, can I ask you about this? I mean, I appreciate your point about saying, look, I work for a company that operates within UK laws, based within the UK.
Yeah.
When I've talked to people about Huawei before, and I say, look, Huawei is a company that has a license to operate in the UK, they'll say it has a partial license, in the sense that the government has done something to Huawei which is very unusual. It said, look, we're not going to give you a license to operate in some of the most sensitive areas of technology and networks, aka 5G. And actually ask the company to take it out. And so by implication, what it's saying is that the next generation of technology developments it's not giving them a license to operate in those, and therefore, if it's not giving them a license to operate in practical applications of those technologies, should we not worry about its research into technologies that go even further, where there's even less clarity about what the social and economic and possibly even security impacts of those technologies might be? How do you guarantee a sense of public confidence and, in fact, government backing for that kind of R&D?
Yeah, great. I mean, it's a really good point, James. You're absolutely right. It's not just about the deployment of systems or solutions such as 5G. The way it works is that all my computers, all my systems are in Newport in Wales. They are completely switched off from anything and anyone. So even colleagues from other parts of Huawei cannot get access to it. Why? Well, as I said, I have to adhere to UK regulations, UK law, and one of the tricky things is always around export control. If somebody can just dip into a server, they can basically get access to the information. That's safeguarded. And more than that, I actually need to go for a delivery, say to another part of Huawei, I need to go to the government, the UK government. I need to ask for an export license. In other words, I have to show them what we're developing and what we developed. Can we export this? And only then we can export it under certain conditions, meaning the way you use it for civilian use only. And quite right, because that's only what we develop. So it's really strictly regulated.
Henk, sorry, just want to say, what's in Newport? Forgive me, I don't know who's the authority in Newport.
So in Newport, basically, that's where our computer servers are. So normally, if you have a company, a big international company like Huawei, you would have servers, computer systems, where the whole corporation globally works on. Sharing ideas, sharing information, sharing files, jointly developing intellectual property or whatever it might be. we have isolated that completely in our systems here in Newport in Wales.
Mhm.
And if anybody wants to get access to it, they have to literally come through me.
And do that, and I suppose there are two questions here that then, and I'm going to do this very clumsily, so apologies, but there are two questions. One is whether or not, in effect, you're cleverer than we are, i.e., that the regulators cannot actually understand the capabilities of this R&D, and therefore will license its export without necessarily understanding its applications. And the second is, in a practical sense, how do you, given the volume of communication, the volume of information that's available, whether it's in a server in Newport or internationally, enable UK government, national security interests and economic security interests to keep an eye on what's happening there, just given the volume of what's happened, i.e. that the UK may have the theoretical powers, but not the practical ability to police this?
Yeah, there's a few elements in terms of the answer. I mean, first of all, we, as you say, we share all the information, but let's argue that on the other side, the government side, there's not the knowledge or the insight, although I have to say there are some very clever people there, but you're right, and the volume. But the practical reason is simply also that, yes, you could do that. That's an approach of trying to get away with it, which,
Right.
well, let's how Sarah put it. You may be able to do that once, twice, whatever. The time you get caught, it's the end of your business. I mean, just imagine our customers, the likes of, whether it's in the UK, a Vodafone, or all the other operators around the world. They're not just interested in their business, they're safeguarding the business, meaning these days, data of their customers. How shall I say this politely? I mean, you screw up once,
Yeah.
you might as well just give up now. This is just not even a non-starter. Of course, there is a lot of information, a lot of it, and compliance, legal compliance is a daily thing that we're on top of, and as best as we can, electronically, manually, etc. But that's a difference between doing that and actually saying, well, it'll be okay, it'll be all right. I mean, you're just dead in the water, really.
I see that. Henk, I'm going to come back to this because it feels to me as though there are two really different registers here to this conversation, aren't there? There's one is China buying influence? Is it going to do that? Is there a soft power question? And there's another one, which is, I think, the one that I'm close to with you here, which is, are there national security issues around collaborative R&D? We haven't touched at all on the first one, Henk, and I want to just bring in, some people have made some points in the chat. I wanted, if I could, to bring in Lucy Huberman, just because, Lucy, I don't know whether you were with us right at the start, but James Wilson put up on the slide the Jesus College case, where I'm not sure whether or not what's been reported is exactly accurate, but there's been this question about whether or not Chinese funding into Cambridge has in some ways inhibited the willingness of people, to call things out or had some impact on the nature of the debate there. How do you think about that?
I don't know the facts of that case, but I think funding research is a bit like sponsorship. And as long as there is a transparent register and the interests of all of the research parties are well documented, not just sort of footnoted with a bit of a, footnote, then I think both researchers and the public, should the public be concerned, and students, frankly, have a much better idea of who is paying for their education, who's paying for the teachers, who's paying for the research. And it may be that it is all innocent. I mean, I was a student ages ago. There were demos when I was a student in my college because they'd taken funding from Iran to fund our new, fabulous library. And Iran was definitely not a good place to be taking money from at that time. So I'm not sure these things are new. Amplification about China, obviously, in the last years because of pandemic, because of Trump, because of national security, and because of the volume of students. I mean, in my department, which is one department in Warwick, we have 1,267 graduate students. I would say 1,000 of them are from China. They all didn't drop out this year in the pandemic. They all stayed, or they all deferred. And I don't think teachers are unhappy about teaching Chinese students, but, I think all of these things need to be made more transparent, that's all.
But Lucy, thank you. I see there are a number of people who joined us today who are kind of living day to day in the academic world on campuses in a way that frankly I'm not. So I'd love to try and bring in as many of those people as possible. I see David Lane's here. I'd love to ask Jeremy Sondelson about this. I saw Simon Harrison is here. Simon, I don't know whether or not you've got a dog in this fight. Hold on, we can hear you now, Simon, far away. Oh, sorry, no, you've muted yourself again. Sorry, just one of those moments.
I should be unmuted, yes?
You are, we got you loud and clear now, yeah.
I do have a dog in the fight because I work for Huawei in their communications division here in...
Okay, fine. So far away, tell me, but far away, tell me, but just tell me, because you made a point in the chat, which is there's an immediate connection between Chinese money and a kind of a negative, you went to work for Huawei, so you see it differently.
I see it completely differently. I take, if you forgive me, James, I take issue with your presentation because...
What? Far away.
When I speak for Huawei, I ask a lot of questions of Huawei. I have a lot of conversations with people like Henk. I have a lot of conversations with journalists about what it is that we do.
Yeah.
A lot of the time we're asked about the politics of China, and I'll be honest, I have no idea why I'm being asked that. Because I have friends who work for Apple, and when Donald Trump built his wall, and said that people couldn't come over when George Bush invaded Iraq, nobody went to Steve Jobs and said, excuse me, we don't want to do business with you anymore. I am constantly surprised that the more controversial parts of Chinese government policy are automatically linked to companies who do business. And that, it's not that I defend in any way the Chinese government, that's not my job. My opinion on it is a sort of almost of no validity. But I would ask that question, why do people say, we don't like what's going on in Xinjiang, you shouldn't sponsor a piece of R&D in a university in Britain that's looking into better connectivity and use of electrical engineering? How are those things related, is my question back.
But Simon, isn't the reason, but you put your finger on exactly the reason we're having this conversation, which is, the concern is, there's sort of three layers of concern here. One is that from the first half of the decade to where we are now, the pendulum has swung too far, right? And there's some people who say what's happening is you're demonizing Chinese companies that are exactly as you suggest. They're private enterprises, they're not involved in government policy, but what's happening is that they're being demonized, and there's a risk actually to all the people Jeanette describes who are Chinese students in the UK who are made to feel unwelcome. There's a human element to this as well as a structural element. So there's one element that's that. But there's a separate view, right, which is that actually we are moving into a world of two competitive systems. I was hearing Eric Schmidt speak yesterday, and the view is that we are naive to think that these technologies are neutral, right? And that as these technologies develop, they are going to be harnessed to one set of values or the other. And that as a result of that, we are naively participating in the buildup of those technologies that won't necessarily be used in the best defense of our values. And then the third element, just so I'm clear, that in the way I read it, Simon, the third element of this is that, yes, of course, it's the case that Huawei is not a part of the government, but is it the case that when you receive money, not from Huawei, I'm saying, but from Chinese companies or Chinese institutions, that inhibits the ease with which you can criticize Xi Jinping or Xinjiang, because the culture of free speech in the West is different to the culture of speech.
Can I come back to you very quickly on that? I know there's several people who want to talk on this call.
Yeah, far away.
To your last point, I'd say no. I'd say the answer is no. It doesn't inhibit me, and I work for Huawei. I don't think it inhibits anyone. And I think one of the most interesting points that you make there, James, is Is there a question? Is Schmidt asking an interesting question about the division of the world? Absolutely, he's asking a question. Do the people on this call want that to happen? Is that a good thing? Do we want the world divided up like that? I would suspect a significant proportion of us would say no. And do we help that stop happening, avoid that happening, or work towards it by working together or by shutting the doors? Yeah. I suspect we divide ourselves more by not doing business with people like Huawei. And I say this not as a Huawei employee, but I think as a human being. And my final point on that would be, if you don't like China, don't do business with them. I'm not entirely sure why people are so fixated with an academic relationship, when in fact, the biggest way to do it is don't buy the stuff. You know, don't go on Amazon and buy things. Boycott.
And Simon, just to be clear on your point about the kind of, do you want to throw up walls east to west, or do you want to build bridges? I think the reason I framed it right at the start, as I did, is that I think that people are frightened on both sides. If you're throwing up walls, there's a fear that you're going to actually stoke a competition into a conflict, and that's dangerous, right? And if you're building bridges, you're fearful that you're naive, right? That you're participating in something that's going to come back and bite you. That's the. But by the way, we're never going to
collaboration. I would say, James, as my final point, is really collaboration.
Yeah.
Post Second World War, let's face it, is probably very rarely bad. It is better that we talk to each other, is it not? You are the last person I would have thought would have argued against that.
Yes, well, you're right. I'm going to bring in. I'm going to just get my colleague Matt Dancona to weigh in, and then I'm going to see if I can come to Jeremy Sarnelson in a second. Matt, you there? What do you think on this?
On the question of universities specifically?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we need to be clear-eyed, which is universities are desperate for money because they haven't got as much as they used to, and they'll be even more desperate now. And so they have what might be called generously an eclectic view of where to get it from. But let's not pretend that the interests of China and Chinese corporations in British universities is wholly philanthropic. I mean, to the point that was just being made about collaboration, great, but let's also not be naive about what has happened and what has changed under Xi. We had a long period of what people call co-opetition. You know, that there was a spirit of economic competition backed up by a kind of effort, which was notable under Cameron and Osborne, and indeed Boris used to go to Beijing quite a lot, to build alliances. But Xi is different, and you know he has an expansionist view of, if not actually taking territory, of extending Chinese influence and power. So I think that what's needed at the moment is a sort of a slight bucket of cold water, just to make people snap to about this, which is that probably the best way of doing it is to look at each and every offer, first of all at face value, and then do due diligence on it. What's the technology involved here going to do? To what use may it be put? I certainly don't think we should close the door on Chinese investment, far from it. But we need not to be naive and think that there is a kind of Nixon in China, Biden in China moment at the end of this. So I don't think there is.
And Matt, just on the question about freedom of speech, do you think that, because there is a question here, isn't there, which is, if you like, the sort of David Cameron, George Osborne era on China feels like it's very firmly over. Johnson hasn't quite gone as far as Tom Tugendhat would want, which is really ostracizing China. But do we think there is actually a risk to freedom of speech on university campuses about China and the Chinese government, or are people sort of finding problems that possibly are not, not as big? I don't know. I'm flailing around a bit here.
I think that's part of a broader problem, which is that freedom of expression on campuses is no longer valued, and so it only takes one academic who has a particular view on China, as we've seen in some cases, to thwart discussions. And what I lament is that there isn't a sort of reflex pushback against that kind of, because there's such a sensitivity in universities now that no form of offence be caused against the nations or minorities or whatever, that it's extremely easy to shut down debate on campuses. So, I don't think there's a systemic threat to academic freedom in this country because of Chinese influence. No, I don't. There may be incidents, of course, and we need to be vigilant about that. But I don't think there's a kind of a Beijing peril on the resolution. I think that's an exaggeration.
Let me go back. I will, Jeanette. I'm going to come back to you in a moment, and Henk too. But I want to ask Jeremy Sarnelson and David Lane about this, and my colleague Tess Murray. So I'm going to go Jeremy first, if I might.
Thank you, James. Let me just disclose, in interest of transparency, my interest, which is that I am the Pro-Chancellor of the University for Creative Arts in Epsom and Farnham and in other places in Kent. And we have a campus in Xiamen, about 1,000 kilometers south of Shanghai. And in the UK, in our campuses, we also have a fairly sizable number of Chinese students. I mean, I think in the context of arts and in the context of academic freedom, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think it was you, James, or maybe Matt, who said that it's not sort of one set of values or the other. I mean, we don't believe that the financial support that we get either in our UK campuses or the support we're getting to run courses in Xiamen from the Chinese government and from other SOEs in any way inhibits our academic freedom. And in fact, in the negotiations that went on to set up our campuses, academic freedom was something that was debated extensively with counterparties. And we made absolutely clear that we weren't prepared to accept any interference with that. So, to my mind, and particularly in the arts sphere, I think there's a sort of different issue than the business sphere, which is that, I personally, and I think my colleagues at the UCA share this belief, that this is an opportunity to sort of build bridges, but also to learn from each other, which is why I say it's not one set of values or the other. So just to sort of wrap up the point, I mean, our ambition is actually that our students exposed to Chinese influences and other international influences will be better students as a result of it. And we will do everything we can, obviously, to ensure freedom of speech and such like are protected. But I think our starting point is perhaps much more neutral than some of the comments I've heard, which is sort of China, ooh, it must be bad. So from an arts perspective, I think there is a different agenda going on, at least certainly at the university I'm attached to.
Jeremy, it's really interesting. I remember when I arrived in China in '96, so I'm I'm a latecomer, if you like, to kind of coverage of China in sort of post 49. I had a friend who described what life was like arriving there in '74 and what life was like in terms of arts and culture, and how completely cut off they'd been from Western arts and culture, so much so that because of suspicions between Chinese and Westerners, that when they arrived, they brought their record collection. And this was a Chinese family who hadn't heard Mozart for years, given the Cultural Revolution. And they went upstairs into their flat, described it as going to their flat, and said, could you put the needle on the record, but disconnect it from the speaker? And they crowded around and they just listened to the sound of the needle on the record so they could hear the music, but not be heard by the listening devices in the apartment, them hearing the music. And I sort of, part of me is still kind of touched by that story, thinking the importance of being able to exchange those things culturally just matters so much, how far we've come to that. Anyway, so that's my sort of emotional moment on this. David Lane, I'm going to ask you to do total gear change, because I know you work in the much further at the robotics end of this. So do you want to just talk through what you think the risks are and what you think are the best systems of regulating them?
Hi, James. Hello, and hello, everybody. Let me start from the beginning. Universities aren't very secure places at the best of times. And the majority of the research that gets done in university gets published in the open literature. So provided the sponsorship allows that, all the sponsor gets is potentially an early mover advantage. The work will be available to everybody. So as long as the work is not defense related or a dual use technology, I'm actually quite relaxed about having taken money from China. I think science and education in general has an important role to play in diplomacy and maintaining links, cultural links, scientific links with people in other countries. That said, the National Security and Investment Bill, which has just gone through and has gone into law, it doesn't have regulation in it about research at the moment, but I think that could well come next. And certainly, my experience in government is there's a lot of thinking and scrutiny going on about that. And it's very difficult to deal with that inside a university environment because it's open, right? So that could mean that therefore universities don't do research on defense, sensitive topics, which isn't going to happen either, because some of the leading edge work, you just don't know where it's going to go, and therefore will it become something in the national security threat. So
but isn't that, sorry, David, can I just ask about that? The problem I've got with all of this, because this is not just a China question, it's an overall AI tech question, is presumably the nature of research is that you don't know where it's going to go. So you can only expect that governments can regulate outcomes rather than inputs, can't they?
That's true, but there are different kinds of research. There's some really crazy ideas, blue sky, nobody knows where it's going to go. But there's also research that's much more applied, that's got a use inspired, that's building demonstrators, where you can see that if this works, it turns into these products and services further down the line. So the blue sky stuff, you're right. The other stuff, take care.
Okay, David, thank you. I wanted, Jeanette, I saw you were nodding away when, particularly as David was talking about universities not being particularly secure places, kind of open and quite transparent. Are you as relaxed as he is about Chinese either institutional, government or corporate funding of research on that basis?
I think that universities are quite transparent about the work. They engage in research so that they can publish it. We've seen the impact of the global league tables driving the rankings, and that this has become quite a significant decision-making factors for governments, where to put their money, where to fund scholars. And the way to climb up the league tables is to publish influential research. The UK is known for its research excellence, and it only makes sense that UK researchers would want to co-publish with the best researchers in the world. And in many STEM areas, the best researchers are in China. I think that military intelligence and technologies has attracted a fair degree of attention. However, if we explore into details other areas, and the arts, I think, is a fantastic example here, we'll probably find that UK influence in terms of co-published research with Chinese scholars is significantly high. Our attention was drawn to a particular high-risk area where these influences basically have attracted a greater level of attention. But I think that universities have been criticized because the evidence is out there, it's in the public domain. What has been done is actually published. And as such, one can track exactly what has happened between researchers from the two respective countries. I quite liked the soft power argument and science and education diplomacy argument there, because education, just like information, it's quite a porous industry. It flows from one country to another. And what I'm seeing more and more is the power of knowledge diplomacy. Mm-hmm. And it speaks to governments and it speaks to decision makers. And it's basically I think the vaccine that was produced that is taking us out of the pandemic has increased again the visibility of how powerful research is. And if I can end it on a positive note, this is something that's worth working together for.
Can I ask? I just want to ask Henk, if I might, to pick up on that, because I think there's a risk here that we have an argument as if the UK is the only place in the world. Imagine a world, Henk, in which the UK says, right, we're not going to have any, not just Huawei money, but any Chinese corporate money going into R&D, right? It's not as though either Chinese companies or Huawei then give up on R&D? Where does it move?
Sorry, where does what move?
The R&D investment. Because I think we want to have our cake and eat it here. We want to be globally competitive. We want to have the best. We want to have what Jeanette's talking about, knowledge diplomacy, but also highest quality of academic expertise and innovation. But we're obviously concerned about some of its knock-on effects. So I just want to know what the risk is of closing the door to some of that R&D investment.
Yeah, I get it. Of course, the short term, if you look at it, of course, has a financial impact. I think several previous speakers already said the extent to which they work with Chinese money. But of course, long term, this would have a huge impact for the UK and for the world. I mean, as I said in my opening remarks, basically any of the world's problems, and Jeanette just pointed to pandemics and vaccine to combat them, can only be solved if you work together, if you collaborate, and if you're basically saying, well, I'm not going to work with China, and you already said, James, how big China is and the scale, as Jeanette was already said, the scale of it. You're cutting yourself off from an enormous part of the world, and I think there's a little bit of a danger here that we view this all in one way, that, oh, well, that's okay, we can cut ourselves off on that because we're in the UK, we're okay here. Hang on, surely UK universities, UK companies want to export. We want to be part of the world. I'll give you one example, and maybe that helps to illustrate and answers your question, even though in a slightly different way, but I think it's a similar kind of thing. Huawei has just been cut out from deploying the 5G public network in the UK. Okay. So you could say the same thing. Where does it go from here? Well, I can tell you where it's gone from here. We've actually put up a 5G accelerator program here in Cambridge for companies and universities to work with our 5G equipment. And everybody, of course, goes, well, what's the point of that? Because you're cut out of 5G in the UK, aren't you? Yes, but that isn't just a UK story. It gives companies in the UK an ability to work with our equipment. Their 5G technology products and applications can now be deployed in the thousands, well, hundreds of thousands of systems that we've deployed elsewhere in the world with our 5G equipment. Why do we do this? We're not a philanthropical institution, absolutely not. But it's in our interest to see these UK companies grow and prosper, because they could be part of our supply chain.
I know, I completely get that, Henk. So that's really interesting. I wasn't aware of that. I want to bring in, if I can, Julia Pamili. Julia, I hope I've pronounced your name right, but you made a point that was further about greater clarity, a greater register of interests. Julia, tell us sort of where you're coming from on this.
Yeah, so I should also disclose I work for the China Research Group, which I'm sure you're all aware of. So I work with Tom Degenhardt. So the issue here, from my perspective and what I put in the chat, was the question of transparency, right? So even kind of leaving aside the kind of normative questions about whether or not you want to have those research collaborations, the reality is at the moment it's an incredibly opaque system. So in order to find out information about which Chinese companies, or indeed any foreign companies, are funding, have research partnerships with universities, the main way seems to be to do SOIs, which we did 20 SOIs, of which only about 10 came back. The other 10 were blocked by universities. So there's clearly a transparency kind of issue there. When you do find information, for example, we found out there was sort of a Chinese AI company funding 20 PhD students at like a leading British university, of which the only evidence online was on LinkedIn. So I think my point is that is where the UK doesn't seem to have caught up. And the obvious comparison here is the US, which has a kind of compulsory register of interest over $250,000 from foreign any kind of foreign research partnerships or investments or donations and so on. So that's the kind of relatively simple ask in response to some of these issues that you discussed.
Julia, what did you make of the integrated review on China, the government's national security review, which on this particular area, I think was looking at a new body to provide some oversight or some check on the interests of those people funding R&D and, if you like, even influence on campus.
Yeah, so there's a new body sitting under the Beijing department, I believe, which is, I think, the research collaboration team.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, it's being in the process of being set up. Will be established in October, and again, the question here is sort of, will it be well resourced and with sufficient capabilities? So yeah, our CAT, that's exactly it.
All right. Well, and can I ask you then, just, this is a kind of slightly personal question, but it's not about you personally, it's about me personally, which is, do you think that when I look at what's happened in terms of the swing, if you like, from the sort of Cameron Tories to the Johnson Tories, and the swing as regards China, that my worry that a world in which we are much more suspicious of everything that China and Chinese companies do actually backfires on us, that there's that creates a certain hostility amongst Chinese people, put aside the government, and that there is a much better world in which we work much more closely together, we get to know each other much more personally. Do you think that is, I'm just generationally out of date on this, I'm just naive about what China's interests are in the West?
So as in, you're concerned that if we sort of push back too hard against the government, that kind of feeds into relations in every aspect of, is that what you're asking?
Well, I tell you what I'm asking. So when I was in China, I was there for the FT, so I'm sure I missed a good deal of really interesting stories, but we really worked hard at one, right? Which was, on the face of it, a very boring, but seemed to me totemic story at the time, which was China's membership of the World Trade Organization. What was really important, and this was post-89, so it was within a political context, but it was obviously post-Deng Xiaoping and the idea of China integrating into the world economy. And WTO membership was central to that because it would bring China in on a set of globally agreed rules. The West campaigned and pushed forcefully for China to agree. And that was really an important moment in the world. And now it seems as though we're saying, actually, we're really quite uncomfortable with China integrated into the world economy because we're suspicious of what its motives are and what the outcomes will be. And so I'm just wondering whether generationally something fundamental has shifted and my wish to see China integrated in the world economy is naive.
Yeah, I think, and this is just to be clear, speaking personally, not on behalf of the group or anything, there was a step change, as Matthew spoke about earlier, under Xi Jinping. And I mean, you read the kind of original CCP documentation, read what they're saying domestically, look at the kind of aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy, which is being kind of pushed up, if anything, ramped up over the last year. I think it's difficult to still see ourselves on that same path that you maybe, especially if you're working in the 90s and early 2000s in China. I mean, that's the perspective, and that comes from looking at how the CCP themselves talk about themselves and how they kind of deal with international politics. So I think, yeah, it's not ideal. Obviously, it would be much better for everyone if this was a smoother kind of integration, but the evidence we have suggests it's not necessarily the case.
I've got, Julia, thank you. I'm going to, before we close, I know I've run a couple of minutes over, but I just want to hear from Ali Bohani, because I know he's done some work on this. And Ali, what's your thinking?
No, sorry, I joined you all a bit late. My take on leading by example is that latest revelations about US and Denmark and eavesdropping and clean network. Yeah. If that is the case, that leaves very little room for moral high ground for China and all the other, counterparties and adversaries around the world. That's one. So US and the West have to lead by example if that is the case. The other thing is that prosperity of China really matters to all of us, not because we're Sinophiles or Sinophobes. It's 1.4 billion people. And I always laugh when I hear some of the analysts and, journals and, essay writers who say, oh, China needs a revolution. And I think that 5% of Chinese population who after a revolution, whether it's velvet, green, orange, or the otherwise, is 70 million people. And if UK and EU are struggling with 1.5, 2 million, 3 million refugees from self-inflicted wounds in Middle East and Africa, what are we going to do with 70 million Chinese who definitely not going to settle in India or in Middle East and will be Europe bound? So we have to work together, and prosperity of China matters. Just a short comment.
Listen, this thing is going on because I think, look, I'll come clear. Often when you have these thinkings, and even this has been fantastically interesting, I just want to say thank you to Henk and to Jeanette, because what you did is probably much more valuable than any of the rest of us. You actually brought some facts and information to a table where there's often instincts and feelings. I think that it's really interesting and actually quite exciting, Jeanette, just hearing what you said right at the beginning about the number of Chinese students in the UK, what they bring, you know, intellectually, culturally, socially to those campuses. And Henk, it's really interesting to understand not just the impact that R&D has on actually academic life, but also on business life. What you said just now about the capacity for businesses to work with that tech and then see how it will work, operate globally. I do think in the end it is a position. I do think that it's in essence, and the reason I wanted to get into it a little bit with Julia and the China Research Group is that I think in the end it is about a worldview. It is about whether or not you think that there is something profoundly suspicious about China, and it is naive to do anything other than to significantly limit its participation in this country, both kind of culturally and intellectually, brackets R&D. Or if you think the risks of widening the gulf between East and West are greater, and so the emphasis should be on finding ways of keeping oversight, greater transparency, and yes, regulation of any areas where there are meaningful social, economic, and military harms. I'm obviously in the latter camp. Right, that's obviously me. I should say within the Tortoise newsroom, we're divided on this. Some people are more skeptical, other people are probably more in my shoes. So I'm not going to try and come out and say, well, here's a judgment of Solomon. But I do think you've got to be clear about that, because it does come down to a worldview. I think the place where those two things most likely come together, fun enough, is actually the point Julia makes, which is, if you have systems where there's transparency, that will create trust. I'm not naive to think that those systems of transparency can't be abused and circumnavigated, and that actually there's a level of complexity here. But at least if you have those registers and if you have those systems of oversight, there's more likely to be some transparency. And I do buy what Henk's point, which is companies are aware of what they need to do to comply with expectations in countries in those markets in order to maintain a license to operate. So I think there is some way of coming together, but you're never going to quite square the circle of two sets of people with different views on it. So if you like, if Tortoise was trying to put together a take on this, you can tell that we would acknowledge the issues, but lean into engagement. I'm sure there will be others who will take the opposite point of view, but let's do that and have that conversation at our next thinking. For today, thank you very much indeed. I hope that wherever you are, you get a bit of a break over the weekend, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks so much.